Hilchis Mechirah Pedek Shisha Ve'esrim. HaMoicher Se'ir. Now, until now we learned someone that sold a house, what's included in the house, someone that sold a chotzer, what's included in the chotzer. Al derech there's someone that sells a merchetz, what's included in the merchetz. Over here we're talking about someone that sells a city, he owns the entire city. So someone that sells a city, so Machar bought him, so all the houses in the city are included in the city. And also Ubayres, Sichnu Ma'aris, all the various different pits, that are reservoirs of water that are in the city, and also merchatzois, the bathhouses that are in the city, and v'shoivchos, and a shevach that's in the city, where the doves are, ubeis habadim, and a place that an olive press, ubeis hashlachim sheba, which are fields which you have to irrigate in those. Can't rely on the rainwater; it has to be irrigated, and also sheba, and also vasmuchala. Smuchala goes on all of them, and those batim, beis, and sichos, which are actually in the city or near the city. Near the city means which in the ibur of the city. We learned the ibur of the city is 70 amas beyond the city. So all of this is considered part of the city. These things that are in the city or vasmuchala, which is near the city. And also ves hacharoshim amukafin law, which means those forests which are near the city. Mukafin law means next to the city. Ves hasodis hayiduis law, and the fields which are outside the city, which is known to be part of the city. And also ves habibrim shel chayev ve'efes v'dogim shepneim kenegda. You have pens where they keep the various different animals and different birds, and also various different places where they keep fish, ponds where they keep fish. And the opening to this area is connected the city towards the city. In other words, the question: how do you get into this area? Do you get this area? The opening to the area is towards the city or the opposite side of the city. So here, if these bibrim of chayev, efes, v'dogim are pneim kenegda, their face, in other words, their opening is towards the city, is afal pishein rechoikim imenu. They're not close to the city. It's not v'asmuchan lo, like the Rambam said before. They're far from the city. So nevertheless, but since their opening is towards the city, we consider them as part of the city. So these are all included in the city. Avolei machar metalton shebetecha. Those movable objects which are in the city are not part of the sale of the city. However, bisman she'omar loy, when the seller sells to the buyer, he v'chol ma shebetecha ani meichel lecha, I'm selling you everything that's in the city, is harei kulan mechur. So they're all mechur. Now, ubenkach, even if he said he v'chol ma shebetecha, he's selling is le'mocher le'es shioreh. Shioreh means if you have part of the city that starts extending, and this keeps extending further, but lepel, there's a hefsek in between. In the middle, there's a place of rocks, which separates the part which is next to the city and the part which extends beyond the city. So that's not really included in the city, even though ultimately you could really walk on this piece of land from the city to the further distance. But since it's separated by very different rocks and like a mountainous area, so therefore it's not considered part of the city. And also V'leis Meiseh, the suburbs of the city, and V'lei HaChorshim HaMuktzim Mimenu, Chorshim are the forests which are far from the city, and V'lei HaChelik Sheyesh La Bayam. Sometimes you have a city which has like a sister city in the Yam, on an island, or V'lei HaChelik Sheyesh La Biyabosh. Again, there's the city, and there's another sister city to the city, which is also owned by the same person, and it's in another area. So that when a person sells a city, it doesn't mean he's also selling that other city, which is considered like connected to this city. It's a chelik sheyesh bayam, or the chelik sheyesh b'yabasha. And also v'leis bibri chayev ve'efes v'dogim she'en pneim kenegda. Those pens of chayev dogim ve'efem, which the opening is not towards the city. So even if you said the city v'chol mashabetecha, that's not included. So the only thing that kol mashabetecha really included was only the metalton. The metalton that's in the city normally is not part of the city. But if you say kol mashabetecha, so then it is part of the city. Masha'enki, those things which are really machatchila not part of the city. So the fact that mashabetecha won't really help. Halacha beis. Hamoicher es hasoda, mocher es ha'avonim hasturis legeder. Those stones that were set up to be a fence, even though they weren't yet permanently. In other words, you didn't put cement on it, but they were already set up as a gather, and they're functioning already as a gather. So those avonim are considered part of the field. And also, avonim shemunachis al huamorim. If you have like piles in the field, and you want to make sure that those piles don't fly away, so you put stones on all those piles. So since those stones are already on the pile, so it's considered part of the field. because that's for the tzorech of the field, of the things that are in the field. And also a mocher sakana machalokim, he also sold those smooth reeds, hamunachim tachas akfanim, which are actually lying under the vines, kedein lahamid sakeren, in order to hold the vineyard up, and they shein letzorcha. And also a mocher satfua hamuchuberes lekarka, he sold the tfuah which is connected to the ground, afal pishigil liikotzer, even though they're already the time for it to be cut. But nevertheless, since at this point in time they're connected to the ground, so they're considered part of the field. And also, machar is mechitza sakanim. Mechitza sakanim doesn't mean kanim which are actually actively as a mechitza. In other words, they're kanim which are growing, and those kanim are the type of kanim which are good to be used as a mechitza because they grow from one kanim comes out another 2 or 3 kanim, and therefore they're like thick. So therefore they're good as a mechitza. So that area which is growing, these kanim are also part of the field. If it's sheep, chusim beis reva. If the area is less than a beis reva hakav, a kav is a sixth of a saw. A saw is 50 by 50, so a kav is a sixth of a saw, and a reva kav is a quarter of this sixth. So male comes out a 24th of a saw. In afal pisha kanim shelo oven v'chazokim, so l'chura there would be a svara that has its own entity, but nevertheless, if this base, the reva, this mechitzas akanim is less than a base reva, so memele, so it's considered part of the field. And also a mocheres hashimeira. Hashimeira is like a hut, which is used for the person that watches the field. Hoasuya betit, which that shimeira is smeared with tit, with mortar. Aval pisheina kfua, even though the shimeira is not really connected to the ground in a way that it's mamish kavua in the ground. So theoretically it's portable, but since it's asuya betit, so it's considered a certain permanence, and therefore it's considered part of the field. And also a mocher sacharuv she'eni murkav, if you have a boxer tree growing in that tree, and that boxer tree didn't reach a point where you started grafting other trees into it. When you start grafting other trees into this boxer tree, so then this boxer tree is like a chashiva tree. You already have other trees, which are shvacher trees, and you're putting it into this tree in order to strengthen it. So that means there's a certain chshivas to this boxer tree. But masha'inkin, if you have the charuv, she'eni murkav, it's not yet something which you started grafting things into it. Or there's psulas hashikma, you have a shikma tree, which that shikma tree also wasn't yet cut. The wood of it was never cut. It's still the original shikma tree without ever being cut. Is afal pisheim ovim, even though these trees are thick trees, nevertheless, they're considered part of the field. And also a macher kalat kolim sheba, he sold all the date trees, all the palm trees which are in the field. So when a person sells a field, again, so what's included in the field is the wall around, the stones which are acting as a gather, even if they're not really connected with cement, and those stones which are on top of the piles of tvuah to hold them, to weigh them down, and those those reeds which are under the kfanim, which are supporting the kfanim. If you have tfuah which is connected to the ground, that's part of it. If you have a mechitzas akanim, if you have kanim growing there, and it's less than a reva of a kav, so that's also considered part of the field. And if you have a shemera, which is the hut, which is also considered part of the field. And you also, if you have a boxer tree, which wasn't yet started being grafted into, or you have a psulas hashikma, or al derech zeh, any of the tkolim, they're all part of the field. However, aval, lei machers v'avonim she'enas duris together. If you have other stones in the field, but they weren't yet set up as a gather, or v'leis v'avonim, if you have other stones, she'ena munachas al gabi amorim, they're not actually placed on the piles of tvuah. Aval pishay muchanis lekach, even though they're there in a pile in order to be placed on these piles of tvuah, but they weren't placed yet. And also v'leis hakanim, and not those reeds, shebekerem she'ena munachim tachas akvanim, they're not there actually under the vines. Aval pishay mushapim mishupim v'chalokim umuchanim lekach, even though they're set up and they were cut in such a way and they were smoothened in such a way that they're ready for this function of holding up the vines, but lapel, they're not doing that. And also v'leis hatfuah ha'akurim and ha'karka, and not that tfuah which was already disconnected from the ground. Afal pishit tzrichel, even though it needs the field. Knows being on the field is good for the tfuah. It's drying in the field or whatever. Being in the field is good for the tfuah. But on the other hand, lapel, since it's not connected to the field, so it's not considered part of the field. That's talking about in a regular case. So So all these things that we just mentioned, the avonim and the kanim and the tvuah akura, so all these things which are not really part of the field, but since Lepel, he said, Hi v'chol ma shebetecha rikulam mechur. Now that's only talking about those things which are in the field, but they're not part of the field. So by him saying Hi v'chol ma shebetecha is rikulam mechurim. However, benkach ubenkach, either way, even if he said Hi v'chol ma shebetecha le machar mechitzas akanim shebeis reva, because the mechitzas akanim is not because it's a separate entity. So if you have a mechitzas akanim which is a base reva, aval pisha akanim shebodakim uktanim, even though they're very thin kanim, so l'chura they're not so choshev. So memela, but nevertheless they're considered a separate entity. And saying Hi v'chol ma shebetecha won't be including this base akanim, base mechitzas akanim, if it is a reva or more. And also v'lei mocher aruga ktana shel psama, if you have like a row of psamim growing there, and sheyesh lo shem b'fnei atzman, that row has its own name, in other words, it has its own entity within the entity of the field. Kigen shekeden lo base varda shel pleni, it's like the rose bush of the rose garden of someone, of whoever it is. And v'leis ha-shemera, and also it doesn't include the shemera is the hut that bisman she'ena asuyi betit, if it's not made with mortar, is afal b'shikvu bar, it's even if it is connected to the ground, but that's not considered part of the field, even if he said Hi v'chol ma shebetecha. And also v'lei mocher sacharuv amurkav, it also didn't include this boxer tree, which you started grafting other trees into it, and v'lei sadna shel shikma, or a shikma tree which was already cut, now it's a sadna shel shikma, v'afila hindaka. And also v'lei macher is a bear shabo, if this field has a bear in it, or v'lei sagas, if it has a pressing, an olive press in it, v'lei shevach, if it has a dovkot in it, ben charevim, ben shleimim, whether there's functioning of shevach or not functioning shevach. Either way, these things aren't considered part of the field. Even if he said, Hi v'chol ma shebetecha, so those things that are lying in the field, like the kanim, the avonim, those things that are lying in the field, the tfuah, the tzakura, so by saying, Hi v'chol ma shebetecha, it's considered ma shebetecha, so therefore it's sold together with the field. Masha'inkin, those things that aren't bottled to the field, so the fact that he said, Hi v'chol ma shebetecha, doesn't make them bottled to the field. Now, Lepel, so we're saying that he didn't sell these things weren't sold. So we're saying, let's say, for example, the bear shaba, the gas, the shevach, all these things aren't sold as part of the field. So he sold in the field, but the bear and the shevach, these things still belong to the original owner. Now, v'tzarech ha-mecher liknes liderech min al-lekeach. In order for the mecher to get to these areas which weren't part of the sale, the mecher has to buy a derech min al-lekeach, kedei sheyelech bei ad eisei ha-bear. In order for him to get to this bear, like we learned before, that when a person sells a house, so even though he wasn't kind of the bear that's in the bottom of the house, unless he specified, but nevertheless, in order for the moicher to get to this area, he has to buy from the buyer. When he sells him the whole field, besides this area, which is not really part of the sale, but on the other end, he didn't retain for himself also a schus in the field to be able to get to that area. However, in Pirish v'Amar chutz mi'elu, he specified and said, except for the bear or the dus or the shevach, is then ain't tzarich likol derech. Because if he wouldn't have specified, it would also have been his. So the fact that he specified is like being moisev in his rights, and moisev in his rights that he doesn't have to be lekech mimenu derech. Now this whole din that these things aren't included is b'moicher, because this is talking about when he sells the item. So therefore we assume that these items weren't part of the sale. Because had it been part of the sale, the lekech should have clearly said explicitly that these things are part of the sale. And v'lei pirish, and since the lekech didn't clearly say that these things are part of the sale, is ainly a sale. When a person gives a present, is kulam. He's kind of all the things that we said. That by a moicher he's not koina, so over here he is koina. Ben besada, ben bebayis, ben bechotzer, ben beisabad. All those things that we said until now, that by a moicher it's not included. That's talking about moicher is not included because since the leker didn't say anything, in the pashtus advarim it's not included. So therefore, it works together. It's not pasha that it's included, and on the other end the leker didn't say anything. So therefore, we say it's not included. Masha'en kain, if it's a noising. So therefore, you can't expect the Makabal to say anything. And there's a svara that called Anesin buying Yofa Nesin. So therefore, all these things are also included. Kloli Shuldova Anesin Karkib Matona Kola Kona Makabal Kola Mechubala. Everything that's mechuber to the karka is included in this matana, achi yifarish, until he specifies that these things aren't mechuber. Things aren't part of this. Halacha vav v'cheino achim shecholku v'zocha echad membesoder is over here. Also, we say zocha b'kulim. Again, when a person sells a field, so lepel, since the leker didn't specify that these things are part of the sale, so therefore we assume that it's not part of the sale. That's the pashtus, since he didn't specify. Mashenka, when a person is given a matana, so the fact that he didn't specify, he's embarrassed to specify. He's getting his a matana. So therefore we assume that everything that's part of the field is considered part of the field. Now that is when they divide the nechasim of the father, and one of the brothers get the field. So over here we say he gets the entire field. One of them was in the soda. We're not going to start saying that these things are not part of the field. That this, if there's a mechit sakanim in the field, it's not part of the field. Or there's a haruv, which is which murkav is not part of the field. Everything is part of the field. Zocha bekulam. And the same thing, someone makes a chazok and nichsi ager, which are hefker, is also hirzik besod. Once he makes the chazok in the field, is zocha bekulam. And al derez of magdish zasod, someone that owns a field, and he went and he held, and it was magdish zasod, he was zocha bekulam. Is higdish kulam. So again, when a person sells a field, so these akbolas, what are really considered part of the sale? These are the things that we learned that are not part of the sale. When a person gives away a field, and al derez there are other things which we said about, which was a bias and a chotzer and a field, and a beis habad, all these things that we said that they're not part of the sale. By a sale, they're not part of it. Masha'enke, when you give it away as a present, it is part of it. And al derez when you zeicha achim shecholku, it's also everything is considered part of it. Anything that's connected. And al derez when you zeicha and a hefker, everything is part of it. And al derez when you magdish it, it's also everything is part of it. Halacha zayin. Av b'meicher v'lekech, when we're talking about when you sell something and someone buys it, where we said that certain things aren't part of the sale, is ein kol elu advar mekiyetz ben minyanim amurim ella b'makom shein sham minik. All the things that were mentioned until now, which aren't part of the sale, ein kol elu advar mekiyetz ben minyanim amurim ella b'makom shein sham minik. They're only said b'makom shein sham minik. And also, it's not specific. Whereas when you say field, you're not really sure what the field means. So Chazal is telling us what is considered in the field and what's not considered in the field. What's considered part of the bias, what's not considered part of the bias. What's considered part of the Beis Habad, what's not considered part of the Beis Habad. So in other words, if there's a clear meaning what this sale entails, when a person sells a field, what does the field entail? Is that it is a mocher. So whatever the minik says that's what the field, that's what a sale entails, that's what the sale is. The same chanal minik. V'chein mokim she'en keden el lebayis levade. Only a bias is called a bias, and anything the for example the attic is not considered a bias. Or shekerin bias lebayis v'chol shvivesav, or the bias is referred to the bias, and also the yatzia is considered the bias. Or l'chol shal gabav, the roof as well. So in other words, we were learning we learned that when you have a bias and you have an attic on top of the bias, and you go to the attic through the ceiling of the bias, that's considered included in the bias. And however, we learned that if you have a bias and there's, let's say, a roof on top of the bias and it has a mica and it has dalaramis al dalaramis, it's not considered part of the bias. The yotzia, which is around the bias, is if it has dalaramis with, it's not considered part of the bias. So on that he's saying it depends. If there's no specific minig, so Chazal told us what's yet considered part of the bias, and what's not considered part of the bias. Let's go back. And those things that we learned that is considered part of the bias. For example, the upper floor, which you have to go through the inside house in order to get there, is not called part of the bias in that place. Anything that's around the bias is also part of the bias. Anything that's on top of the bias is always hilchen acher loshen anshi amokim. Always bakel hilchen acher hashemus or aruchis b'vi akel, according to the way the language that people speak. Zeikar godel b'chol divrei masu matan, that hilchen acher loshim neyodam be'esi amokim be'esi aminik. Whereas according to the people of that place, v'acher aminik, according to the meaning of that place, That's all deals that are done in Masav Matan are done al das according to the minig hamokim. Avul mokim she'en yadua b'minig v'lishemus miyuchadim. There's no specific minig in sales, and also there's no specific names, nor is what's included in bias and what's not included in bias. El yesh keren kav, yesh keren kav. Some people call the bias including the top floor. Some people aren't without the top floor. Is oisen k'meshapir shel chacham prokamelu. So then you go according to what Chazal told us in these prokim.